Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, would like to welcome you. Ladies and gentlemen, would like to welcome you to this event where we're going to be discussing the book Bullets to Ballots. And we have had a number of specialists who have written this book, and this was edited by Dr. Omar Ashour, and we congratulate him for the issuance of this book. So we have a number of chapters, bibliography, and the transformation from armed group to non-violent political work. This is not a new phenomenon. So there are many groups and movements that have been active and have been studied. Only 20 of those groups have been defeated, and 114 of those groups and movements have joined political movements in the form of social and political parties. So this book, through the different chapters, try to give us answers and solutions to these transformations. Why do they happen, and wonder what are the conditions and what are the conditions for the continuation of peaceful work, in order to shine light on this book and the most important recommendations that have been reached by the different authors. We have a number of speakers such as Dr. Mohammed Omar Ashour, who was the editor and the writer of the first chapter, and he wrote chapter number 13, who talked about the transformations of non-armed groups. And Dr. Omar Ashour is a professor of security and military studies and the director of the critical military studies at the Arab Center, and also he worked as an assistant professor at McGill and Exeter, and he has authored many books, such as the book that was edited by Routledge, and he shined light on a number of topics and the countries such as Egypt. And we have also two other cases that we're going to present to you, cases about Syria and Iraq. And we have had Dr. Hamza al-Mustafa, and also there is a chapter about Jaish al-Mahdi. Dr. Haider Saeed is a researcher at Al-Arabi Center, and also he is the editor-in-chief, and also he writes in a number of themes and talks about human development in Iraq, particularly in the period of 2009 and 2014. And he has authored many books, the recent of which was in 2022. Also, we have Dr. Hamza al-Mustafa, who wrote chapter number 4, entitled From Bullets to Negotiations. And also, he tried to compare between Ahrar al-Sham, Jaish al-Islam, Legion, or Faylaq al-Sham. He has got a PhD from the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom, and also has a master's in political science from the Doha Institute. He was a researcher at Al-Arabi, and he has authored a book about the Syrian revolution in 2012, in addition to a number of studies. So after these chapters, we're going also to have Dr. Osama Rushdi, who is the writer of chapter number 3, who is going to talk about the Islamic Jama'ah in Egypt, from armed confrontation to political work. And he is a member of a number of associations, particularly the Journalists Association and Najda Human Rights Association. And he used to be the previous spokesperson of the Islamic Jama'ah, and also the political consultant for the Construction and Development Political Party. And also we going to have Mr. Ronnie, who is going to be with us also in this seminar, who has been the Minister of Intelligence Services in South Africa, and he has led a number of reforms in South Africa, and he has contributed to the writing of this book, From Bullets to Ballots, Lessons from South Africa. So his testimony is going to be based on his experience and as a commander of guerrilla warfares in South Africa. So each speaker will be allocated between 10 to 15 minutes. So we have simultaneous translation available. You can pose questions through Zoom and through the other social media platforms that are broadcasting this seminar/webinar. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you very much for this presentation. I would like to extend my thanks to Al-Arabi Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies, and I would like to thank Dr. Azmi Bshara also for being so enthusiastic vis-à-vis such a project. I would like to congratulate everybody, the center and the participants in this particular project. I'm not going to be lengthy. I'm just going to give a general framework about the book and the project and a number of conclusions. And should you wish to have more information, so the book is available and you can have access to it. As it was expressed by Dr. Ahmed, so the project is about how, when, and why do armed groups decide to drop their weapons and join political work. Why do they decide? When do they decide to change their behavior? Why do they decide to have a kind of a legitimate framework for their new work, which is the political work, and they restructure themselves in order for them to be able to serve this new kind of direction, either to become a social movement that has social political activities but do not take part in the election process, or to resort to political work through elections. So we have had a number of countries such as Spain, Syria, the UK, Uruguay, and so on and so forth. And there are 15 countries, and we have 20 different cases of organized groups that belong to different ideologies. So ideologies that are based on religious interpretations or based on nationalistic interpretations or ethno-nationalistic interpretations. So these are the bases upon which they are established. So what are the conditions for them to continue, and what are the pathways that these groups can undertake when they decide to move and be transformed and start peaceful work? Does this only happen in defeat, or does it happen as a tactical move? So these are some of the questions that have been posed. So does this happen after military victories, such as cases of Nicaragua and Ethiopia and Afghanistan? So does this happen when there is a draw? So when there is a change in the pathway of fighting, whether this is the fighting that takes place between this group and other groups, so when they are fatigued as a result of a long war or warfare. So are these the reasons why they decide and opt for social and political work? So this was the framework. So I'm going to move very quickly because I know that I do not have a long period of time to present my presentation. So the conclusions. So we have had 6 conclusions that we have reached and that we have reviewed after looking into the terminology and also the theoretical framework. So the 6 conclusions, 4 of which are at the level of the organizations. So first we have the command of these groups for these transformations to be successful without any rifts, without any conflicts among the factions, and for it to be sustainable, we have to have charismatic commanders, such as the case of Mandela and other Islamic groups. So taking into account also the other variables, such as the size of the group, the ideology, and so on and so forth, irrespective of the features of the armed group. So what is the role of the commander, the leader, when it comes to this transformation from military to peaceful work? So we have had a number of kind of commands or leadership. So whether this is a spiritual leadership or a military leadership. So these are the kinds of leaderships that we have had in the study. And of course, there are some details related to that. So the second variable, which is directly linked to fighting pressure and also the pressure of war. And I have referenced a controversial article which is entitled Give War a Chance. And here, give war a chance. So the summary of which is that war gives both belligerent parties an idea about the bloodshed, the pressure that would arise as a result of the continuation of such war. So on that basis, so many ideas are being reviewed, the different ideologies are reviewed, and also the political calculations are also taken into account. And we have something else which is new when it comes to the literature around us. So irrespective of the outcome of rebellion, whether it leads to victory, defeat, or draw. So the governmental side would do the same thing, even if the result is defeat. They need to review themselves, and the case of Algeria is very clear, and also we have a case from Colombia, but the speaker from Colombia was not able to be with us. The time now in Colombia is 4 a.m., so it's not possible. So the pressure of fighting also constitutes an impact. So the third outcome, which is to do with the different internal interactions between the commanders, the spiritual, the organizational, the middle command, and individuals within the same group, and also those who think in a different way. So this includes political parties that adopt violent activities, and also previous armed groups that have dropped their weapons, and this would include jihad and also the Islamic Jama'ah in Egypt, and also ELN and the FARC, and also we have the Syrian case that Dr. Hamza is going to talk about in detail. And also, one of the findings that we have found in the literature, that some of these changes happen even before the fighting comes to an end. And the case of Syria is a case in point. And there are changes that happen at the level of behavior, at the level of discourse, and at the level of ideology and organization. All of these changes are towards or move towards the end of battles, the end of war. And as a result of that, a framework is established whereby political parties would be established. So this applies to the Syrian and also to the Afghan case. So we have a whole chapter dedicated to that. So when we expect victory even before it happens, and we have some details as to how Taliban used to change its behavior, its media discourse and mobilization that used to be different from what used to happen in the 90s. The fourth outcome is the incentives. So we have found out that in all cases that there were incentives given by the ruling party or by the international community given to the organizations that seek to have complete transformation and resort to peaceful activities and work. And what we found out also is that there is a linkage between the outcome of fighting and the incentives. If the result of the fighting is close to a draw and the incentives are very high, so if there was an organization, so we're talking about the armed group in Colombia, an organization that used to claim that it was representative of the periphery, and in a peace deal, 5 seats were allocated to this particular group in both houses in parliament, and so they bartered. And in the elections, they got less than 1%, so 0.38. So this was the level of support that they enjoyed in the areas that they claimed to be representative of. So they had no support, as the results show. As we discussed in one of the papers, so what do the revolutionaries do in elections? What results do they achieve after they hand over their weapons? So this was the case when it comes to Colombia. So the pressure of war is linked to the incentives. Let's suppose if the fighters are close to defeat, so the number of incentives are going to be very limited, as it is the case in as it used to be in Algeria and the situation there. So let's move now to the macro level. We have found 2 variables, one at the level of the state, which is the democratization of the state, including reforms of security and oversight on armed forces, and also in some cases we have also transitional justice. So the speaker who is going to talk about South Africa is going to shine light on this particular point. So transitional justice can lead to some resistance at the level of the armed forces. And last, international and regional support. So in European cases in particular, not all of them, of course, particularly when it comes to the IRA. So the European Union put pressure and tried to let the IRA drop their arms and weapons. So we have had some other cases in Central America, in El Salvador. The American Congress at some point in time intervened for the El Salvador government to review its elections law to give a just opportunity to the areas that supports the revolutionaries. So this was the level of intervention. So if they are not given a fine or a fair share in the elections, so this would lead to rigging the elections, and therefore it would lead to another episode of civil war. So we have had a number of organizations that did not have large interventions as well.
I went beyond my time limit, So I'll leave it here and allow my colleagues to continue the discussion. Thank you, Dr. Omar, for respecting the time limit. I move to Dr. Haider. Dr. Haider Saeed, the floor is yours. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I would like to thank my colleague, the Strategic Studies Unit, and Dr. Omar for organizing this event to discuss our book in question. But before that, I'd like to thank Dr. Omar to allow us all the opportunity and also for the chapter I'm going to focus on. This was an opportunity for me, in fact, to learn starting from the conference itself, then the publication of the chapter, then the book published in English, and then this symposium. It's my pleasure now to return to this chapter, and as Dr. Ahmed said about Al-Mahdi army and the Sadrist trend and the conflict between them. For years I've been planning to write about the Sadrist phenomena, but I did not have the opportunity until Dr. Omar Ashur gave me the opportunity to participate in the project to write a book about armed conflicts, from arms to peace. This gave me the opportunity to take part in the conference itself, the conference which was entitled From Weapons to Peace, to have a look at the development of the armed groups and their relations with political establishments and entities. I did my bit. I also went beyond that, benefiting from the generosity of Dr. Ashur to talk about I need to hear. It went down. Put it back how it was before. Why did you change it? I'm not hearing like before. Before was better. Put it back how it was.
No, something before.
Lead me to a group of questions which are very important. Are these armed groups, do they have their own dynamics and their own logic which would allow them to develop in isolation from the political content? When I say political content, I mean a bigger concept of ideologies and the like. Is this linked to the political ideology, and does this ideology impact its development? And also, do these armed groups impact the process of political development? In order to keep up with the project, I focused on studying the Jaish al-Mahdi, which is the armed manifestation of the Sadrist trend. If I were to study the Sadrist trend as a political trend, I wouldn't have needed or resorted to study the Jaish al-Mahdi as the armed manifestation of it. I would have focused on, alternatively, on the social aspects of the foundations of this trend and the Shiite elites, although I did not delve into much detail in that, but I looked from the point of view of anthropology and political science, I looked at the development of the socio-political foundations of their power base. Similarly to the study about Al-Dahiya, the southern Beirut district where Hezbollah is active. Instead of generalizing as saying the vast majority of the political grassroots of Tayyar al-Sadri are poor Shiites, I said they are the Shiites living in the suburbs and the shanty towns of major, on the peripherals of major city. So this is a socio-political, even with the migration of people from southern Iraq and living in the district of Baghdad, which used to be called Revolution City, to Sadr City. Now they are like the southern suburb of the city of Baghdad. So I wanted to revisit this concept of Dahiya or suburb. So I either classify them as exclusively militias or armed groups of political groupings which were established later on after the establishment of the political wing, and they are linked to it structurally. And in the conclusion of the book, the last two chapters were written by Dr. Omar, which included some conclusions which will allude to. Dr. Omar Ashur, the writer of these chapters and the editor of the book, does not specify whether this armed group started as an armed group independently or was it the armed group of a political organization. When I studied the Mahdi army, I was forced into look at this from the historical point of view. All these armed groups were armed wings of political parties until they come to power. So it was natural that this perspective, which I employed in this chapter, led me to the mechanical question: is Mahdi army the armed wing of the Sadris, and was the relationship similar to the Ansar and the Communist Party, or the Peshmerga of the Democratic Kurdistan Party, or the National Guard and the Ba'ath Party? In my opinion, I think I discovered that this phenomena goes beyond the classical case of just being the armed wing of a political organization, and the feature of violence employed, regardless of they are armed wings of a political wing, they are called radical organizations, because they are classified from this point of view of radically of being violent. This is from April 2003, was part and parcel of the Shiite Islamist movement, which started to develop roles and open prospects for a new political system in the aftermath of the demise of the previous system. So Jaish al-Mahdi or Mahdi army was not established as a conventional militia. I benefited from some American studies based on some of the battles by the Mahdi army against American units, which show that it was very poor performance and dysfunctional. It was looked more like a state of mobilization of people rather than a proper army. This led to questions about the identity of the Sadri trend. Is it a political trend or is it an armed group? which was established in the immediate aftermath of the American invasion and developed in 2007, and especially in the Battle of the Al Fursan, which was fought against the Iraqi army in 2008. The other conclusion is a hybrid identity, as they called this hybrid organizations with a military slash political wing make the armed groups tend to adopt the political ideology. Number 5, there is a relationship between the political power and the power of the military wing. Unless the political wing is strong enough to control the armed wing, similarly to what happened to the Saraya Salam, the peace brigades, which was formed later on. Number 6, the situation of that Dr. Omar Ashur has reached, and that is armed groups after military defeat tend to engage in attempts at political reform, and this is similar to what happened to the Mahdi army after their defeat in 2008 in the Al Fursan battle against the Iraqi army, which was an important point to turn towards political participation, and then they took part in the government, and even at a larger level in the second Maliki government 2010. Of course, this is part of the argument in the book that Dr. Omar alludes to, and in my estimation, the fact that any trend or political trend engages in the game of power sharing and elections, and also which engages in a degree of democratic change, made the Sadrist trend accept the conditions and the limitations of the political process. But because this is an armed political and religious trend, the most important question which falls them of whether or not they should approach the idea of being a political party. Here we reach the second theory. The defeat of 2008 did not lead to the idea to dissolve the military wing completely. I would like to clarify this matter by saying that the defeat, because of the very nature of the Sadrist trend and the Mahdi army, whether to do with how to control the hierarchy of the organization, and in an attempt to build a more organized and better disciplined military wing, led to the Saraya Salam experiment, which has not been studied. Number 8, this is all in the book, but maybe they have not been discussed properly, but it was clear to me because of the different divisions amongst the Sadris, and because of the differences on the role of the political side of the trend. It was not just due to internal dynamics, but I think most essentially they were directed by an outside power, which is Iran. This outside power used to really plan the actions according to its own needs. So therefore, they were they were talking about working peacefully, and then suddenly there was the announcement that there was a covert military wing within. All of this means that the outside influences sometimes are stronger and more influential than the internal. Finally, I want to add 2 points. After finishing the work on this chapter, I started taking more interest in the armed and military activism amongst the Shiites in Iraq. Al-Mahdi army was the sort of space from which all of the other armed groups were born, whether they still belong to it or not. This armed Shiite activism was trying to determine the Shiites' position vis-a-vis the political system. They were also trying to reach a sort of a relationship with. A lot of researchers are saying that these Shiite armed groups are on the way of being similar to the Revolutionary Guards in Iran. I think this is not so accurate. Maybe they are becoming the secret guards of the state, the deep state activity. Finally, a lot of writings about Al-Mahdi army, and what is important amongst them are not in Arabic, in fact. I don't want to generalize here, but if there are serious writings that were written in English, of course, our chapter is in Arabic, and maybe this is our contribution as people who speak and write in Arabic. I spoke to many who have leadership positions within the Sadri trend. They gave me very important insight and witness accounts, which is very important for us. And thank you very much, and may God bless you all. Thank you, Dr. Haider, from the Mahdi army and its developments to the Islamist movements in Syria, Dr. Hamza Mustafa. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Chiefly our paper with which we participated in the book, we did not allude to the cases in Syria alone, although this was our objective. But we were trying at the same time to gauge how the Syrian situation can be developed into studying a bigger field of research to do with the Islamic movements. Maybe this is new after the Muslim Brotherhood won elections in 2005 and then Hamas. Most studies focused on what we call the radicalization. After 2005, studies focus on de-radicalization and moderation. There was variable-oriented comparisons reaching some theoretical conclusions. This is, of course, very difficult for a very simple reason. this book may close a gap or be just the gateway to what I think studies, in my opinion, should start with this field, because the participations from the Arabic speaking world are very minimal indeed. This book is providing new models through comparisons to see how we can study the changes in Arab Islamist movements. So far as I don't know, maybe I'm confused a little bit. I just feel dizzy a little bit. I'm sorry about that. In this field, the Syrian situation provides the added value of the Syrian case is that how we can study the changes, the ongoing transformations which have not ended yet, transformations under continuity. This is the added value that the Syrian case can provide. But the study mainly and the PhD thesis, it deals critically with the most important or the main concept of these studies. When we talk about the transformations in Islamic movements, it's like walking a minefield, radicalizations, de-radicalization, moderation. These are normative concepts. Dr. Radicalization comes from the radix, the Greek word Marx considered. This is from Dr. Azmi's studies. This is a person who deals with the issues at their roots. In Islamic studies, radicalism carries negative connotations. Maybe if I quote Dr. Azmi, he defined radicalism at the level of individuals and parties as a person who rejects middle of the path solutions because accepting them would lead to the continuation of the civil war or the issue. The de-radicalization also within this normative framework is very varied, because we are talking about individual de-radicalization or collective de-radicalization. When Dr. Omar's main participation comes through this perspective. At the same time, you will also be confronted with different paths. For example, de-radicalization, disengagement, and then at the individual level, we distinguish between organizational behavior, etc. And the same thing applies to the moderation. Moderation at the level of the behavior, moderation at the level of the groups, and the ideological behavior at the level of the individuals, which means embracing democratic values. My study gave a large space to how to find definitions which are close enough, or the closest that can be, to include the current context. In the context of the Syrian revolution, for example, radicalization or de-radicalization is linked to the revolutionary state. There is also the aspect of some Islamist Islamist organizations who did not embrace democracy, or they've given up violence but did not denounce it. The Muslim, the Muslim Brotherhood were considered as moderate by the West, but then later on during the war established armed group. There is a demoderation, a new term. For example, how are you going to classify the Justice and Development Party as and also when we
need to turn on.
if we want to establish to how these radical movements are interacting with this, with which center, mainly this center was classified as the state. For example, if there is a state which does not provide structured political opportunities, how can change take place? Here we can raise some theoretical questions. All the focus was on the question of why you want the root causes, the determinants of these transformations. And lately there was the question of how. Now you want to study not the outcomes of the process of transformation, at least at the research level, whether this faction will become radical or moderate, and we can come out with political recommendations. At the academic level now, most studies are concerned with the mechanisms of change or the process itself, because they are the ones who determine or can determine how the path should be and what determines its main direction. One path, they start, the Islamic movement start as radical, then there'll be de-radicalization, then moderation. For this reason, regarding studying the Islamic movements as social actors, the social movement theory, and also the parties which are described as reformist parties like Hizb al-Wasat, Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, or others. But now there is a new trend regarding the transformations in armed Islamist groups when they are compared as social actors. In my point of view, researchers are engaged in three main, either testing theory or developing theory or producing theory. What I did, and very simply through this paper, was an attempt to testing theories and the political process approach. This is an old methodology used to study the black organization and communities in the United States, and also to study radicalism. I tried through this study to argue how the three main pillars, first, political opportunity, structured political opportunity, which decides one way or another the mechanism of the opportunity and threat mechanism, which can agree with what Dr. Amos talked about the incentive and the state of virtue, and also another thing which is known but which is used to study resources mobilization, which is being implemented now to pre-war networks, which are very important, and the informal networks, and how can this how to rationalize the choices, and then the choices of the leaders and the grassroots supporters. Dr. Sari Hanafi said a nice thing, that the most important thing in social studies is that it brought down the Islamists from heavens to earth. We're now talking about ideology, and this framework and the current modern studies are distinguishing between the ideological frame and framing ideology, and the framing process, which is one way or another linked to the process of delegitimization of the opponents and providing justifications, etc. And theoretically speaking, at least for me, it opened the door to study a new group of terminology like the demoderation, and how we can redefine some of these terms. For example, regarding the Syrian case, the synonym to that Syria was the word revolutionary. For example, the flag of independence became a symbol of comparison, and also how taking part in negotiations was a reflection of moderation, political moderation. And Dr. Omar Ashur defines the organizational de-radicalization as dismantling of the armed wing. Also joining the national army, which means that you engage in a war as an individual. This can be considered organizational. I attempted to see how can we have a real Arabic participation in order to, I'll leave it here, and maybe we can say more in the questions and answers. Now we move to Mr. Osama Rushdie. Maybe this is a testimony more than a chapter in the book. Thank you, Dr. Ahmed. Thank you, and our thanks to the Arab Center and to Dr. Azmi Bshara and Dr. Omar Ashur, head of the strategic studies and the editor of this book, which is in English and in Arabic. And we thank the state of Qatar for their patronage of these events. And this, of course, complements the role of Qatar as a mediator in Afghanistan, Chad, Darfur, and other places. This kind of event reinforces this role. Regarding the initiative by the Jama'ah Islamiyah in July 79, now after 25 years after this initiative, which remained steadfast and developing, and which I'll add some updates in the last 4 years. But in my writings, I said the initiative of stopping violence was not an admission of defeat. It was a reflection of Islamic understanding which led to that violence only led to consolidating despotism and authoritarianism, and violence is not an aim in itself, but these ideas and similar ideas which were developing in Egypt, there were other jihadist movements developing elsewhere outside Egypt. So therefore, Jama'ah al-Islamiyah took this decision at a time when other organizations were formed, like the International or Global Front to fight. And when Zawahiri established his organization, he had only 5 other people with him. So at that time, we thought that this approach was leading the Islamists into an unaccepted levels of violence. If we want to say, if there was some sort of an accepted violence, but when we know what happened with Algeria and or GIA for short, when we were following their ideology, we were in intellectual confrontation with those. They were based in London. They ended up with the infamous fatwa of allowing the killing of siblings and offspring, wives and children, and etc. etc. When they reached a point whereby when they were told that one of their commanders was killed, they used to say, he's enjoying himself with the women we took from the school of so and so as concubines or whatever. So therefore our decision was a strategic decision. We were amongst an environment of a movement with almost every single individual member was highly educated. We were not a takfiri group, a group which calls for the excommunication of everyone else. So therefore, eventually we reached this initiative. Of course, the regime did not respond positively until the 9/11 events. Yes, of course, the regime itself, after a long confrontation and many victims, they felt they were exhausted too, and also because of widespread extrajudicial killings, torture, etc., executions. But the decision was the right one and an opportune one, taken at the appropriate time, and despite all the obstacles which we faced then and are still facing now, maybe I'm presenting certain things pertaining to the activities by the Hurriyat Center in Istanbul, and I'm honored to take part in their work. We find that the Jama'ah Islamiyah or Islamic group, the members of it played a role in establishing the Bina and Tanmiya party, which is development and party, which played a mediating role and a conciliatory role with other powers. So maybe we are the only group now who are able to deal with all the different factions in the political scene in Egypt. We're trying to establish a national umbrella, an Egyptian national umbrella, which cannot be confined to one political trend. For this reason, we find that many activities, which include all different aspects of the political spectrum, and we study the situation similarly to what happened in 2018 and the Arab Revolution and the events of March 2019. And can these groups be used as tools for change and transformation? And other papers on the importance of assessing the role of propagation and the spreading of Islam and the political work. And of course, after the January Revolution, maybe the Islamic groups and the biggest amongst them were the Muslim Brotherhood were prepared well enough, but maybe we should take steps. You cannot engage in politics with large groups with different roles and different commitments and linkages. Political work needs specialization, and political parties are academies for producing political cadres who can play different roles in the state, like the environment, security, the economy, and others. So therefore, political work requires specialization, and the political work cannot be managed from the consultative Shura Council of a group. So therefore, we must benefit from our period in exile to revisit some ideas and reassess our political work. And also, 10 years after the establishment of the Party of Building and Development, which documented the role of the party and the group, and also to assess all the different activities of the party and the group. It is unfortunate that the current regime on the 30th of June 2020 dissolved the party, and I mentioned in my paper that a lawsuit was issued, and in the last 3 years there were attempts to pressurize the party to change its policies. You know, the party was informed from day one that you are not targeted and anything, but of course it was not honorable to that. Unfortunately, some groups described as Salafi parties, but the position vis-a-vis the military coup is unacceptable, even if the opposition to a certain extent was peaceful. Of course, the opposition is peaceful and sometimes even passive, but we live in an age that anybody who's not with us is a terrorist. This is the equation in application now. Therefore, the party was dissolved after 3 years of the lawsuit, and then the book, a book was published about battlefields to the peaceful work or whatever. This was amongst other initiatives like Together for a Better World. This was the latest initiative on the occasion of the World Cup finals in Qatar and exchange visions over cultural exchanges. It was an initiative by the youth to confirm that this kind of groupings can ultimately lead to some sort of an understanding between civilizations to end this confrontation. So far as the international position, we raised our case with the European Court of Human Rights, and we won on the 19th of April 2019, although the European Commission did not object to, but they once again relisted the group on the terrorism list. Last May, the American administration has raised the name of our group from the terrorist list, although in 1998 they were thinking, the WikiLeaks said they are the American administration was thinking about that from 1998. Also, there was also another list because of the Gulf crisis and Egypt with Qatar. Because unfortunately, this question of terrorism is misused as a pretext for oppression, and the oppression committed against opponents who fight terrorism.
Thank you very much. We would like to give the floor now to Mr. Ronnie Casters, who is going to be live with us via Zoom. The floor is yours. طاب عصركم جميعا. إن أتشرف أن أكون معكم. تحياتي وتهانية للمركز وللدكتور عاشور. الكتاب الذي تم إصداره هو كتاب مهم جدا ويستحق أن يتم نشره على نطاق واسع. أجد المحتوى والمتحدثين فعلا يثيرون الكثير من الاهتمام. إذن دعوني في بداية الأمر أن أتقدم.
From the book itself, from the conference that we held some years ago in Doha, we have to keep in mind that armed groups in history, in the last century and then post 9/11, are extremely different ideologically, in goals, in the methods they used. Some are very extreme. There are those on the right, there are those on the left. There are fundamentalist groups, there are groups that pursue pure terror of populations in their methods, which we totally condemn and are absolutely counterproductive. And I would say we find in successful popular groups of the people the commitment to just cause and just methods of struggle. Just methods don't mean taking the war to the oppressor and the forces, the security forces, army, police of the oppressor. So in terms of this, those who participated in our conference some years ago will recall I did raise a point that it's not simply from bullets to ballots, but we have to examine the conditions that led to the move from general political organization, popular mass struggles against colonialism, struggles against dictatorship, and so on, which in many cases led to decisions, as in South Africa after the Sharpeville massacre of 1960, the banning, the outlawing of all organizations, etc., which gave the ANC liberation movement, Mandela and company, and of course it wasn't just a single leader, it was a collective and a organization that was steeled in nonviolent struggle over many decades, to decide that there was only one option open, and that was a recourse to arms, because the regime had blocked all means of peaceful change. And this is very important. So to understand outcomes, we have to, in every case, examine the conditions leading to the decision to go for armed struggle, and where the decision's been taken in the manner that I've referred to in South Africa. And South Africa is by no means exceptional. In fact, it's a very general condition of people under occupation, Palestinian people, those elsewhere, people under invasion, and people under dictatorship. Time comes when there's no recourse but to resort to arms, and where the politics is clear and the political goals and objectives, there's a much greater possibility of successful outcome. And that doesn't debar the question of negotiation. When the ANC took their decision in 1961 actually, the question of the possibility of negotiation, although it was felt far removed, almost the way the Palestinians would view possibility of change through negotiating with Netanyahu and the oppressive Zionist colonialist regime. The same in South Africa. But in terms of the foresight, the question was there in the manifesto that declared war, that we would carry on with that armed struggle until the regime or the oppressor colonial community, which was white supremacist in South Africa, came to their senses and realized that the only way of securing coexistence, of security for everybody, was through a legitimate process of democratization. And I'm not using that in a simple, narrow Western term, because the way it's used, quite frankly, by freedom-loving United States regime or the European regimes, the former colonial regimes, creates a lot of problems. We talk about it in terms of social justice, justice for the people to participate in their own affairs and own outcomes through their own elected representatives. And that was achieved in South Africa to a tremendous degree. I'd also like to make the point that we need to keep in mind the different international conditions, the conjuncture which gave rise to the very positive armed struggles of the 1960s, post-Second World War, the decolonial processes, Africa, Asia, Latin America. These struggles, these armed struggles fit in to the way I've defined the ANC's approach from all those continents, and the Palestinian process included. So post particularly 9/11, with the American war on terrorism, which basically has become the American, and with it, the NATO alliance, the Western former colonial countries making up the EU, and of course they bringing in smaller countries from Central Eastern Europe, but essentially a Western project. In terms of that, we must understand the conjunction now and the ways and means in which people around the world have responded, and in some cases, the recourse to very extreme forms of violence with very debased objectives. And the book refers to this, and we've looked at this around the world. It's also interesting, and I just want to quickly refer to some case studies, which, of course, as Omar's book shows, it's not saying that everything's rosy, there's going to be a rosy outcome. In fact, many of the case studies show the contrary. If we look at what's happened in Libya, in Iraq, the condition of the Palestinian people today, the fact, if we look at Latin America, we saw in Peru a move towards democratization, which was overturned by a coup, and now the peaceful but active resistance of the people being massacred. We've seen in Colombia there a different move in which a oppressive regime has been replaced democratically by a progressive regime, which clearly is giving the opportunity for a positive resolution to the armed conflict that is being dragged on there. We've seen in relation to two countries I know very well and have been involved in peace processes. The one is Northern Ireland, the Irish situation, in which all the very positive points about reform process from armed struggle to democratic process was evident. And I disagree with the input in the book on the issue, which is not written by a IRA or even a Sinn Féin, their political apparatus that has moved towards the Good Friday Agreement, where the point made there is it was all down to Britain's counterinsurgency. That's totally wrong. It came about through a political leadership within the Irish Republican movement, moving from armed struggle to peaceful process through the Good Friday negotiation. But look what the UK government is doing. The UK government is preventing the real logical outcome of that process. So we must point to those governments which become real obstructors to this process. And although Spain has seen a move towards a social democratic government, the fact is that ETA and its political wing, they were the ones who unilaterally decided, not in conjunction with the Spanish government, which refused to recognize them, but to put down arms. And to this day, there's been no reciprocity.
Okay, Ronnie,
So
two
it's a
minutes to
complex
conclude, Ronnie, please.
situation to enable me to come more quickly to a conclusion.
2 minutes, please, to conclude. Thank you, Ronnie.
Sorry, have I got time? I wasn't
Yeah.
sure of that.
بعضكم
Anyway, until
على
I
أي
stop,
حال.
I want to take on, in response, providing the South African way of handling it, the very informed and useful points that Brother Omar Ashur was presenting. He talked about 6 factors for success. So very quickly, the first one he refers to is the command issue, the leadership, and the question of the charismatic leader and the importance. I want to make the point that whether it's spiritual, whether it's military, the political factor, the social justice factor is the most important. And Madiba, or Mandela, as we called him, Nelson Mandela, in fact, was not a single leader. Of course, he had enormous import and following. But there was an incredible collection of leadership with him, which assisted in the process. Secondly, the term give war a chance. So we can turn it on its head. I don't want to use it in the cynical way that the original proponent in his writings refers to it. In South Africa, when we took the decision, when there was no other recourse for change, to turn to armed struggle, in a sense, that was not give war a chance to to bring frustration in the end and tire out people. The ANC, the MK manifesto was, we will fight until we can achieve a just negotiated settlement. So, of course, we were talking about the option for armed struggle because we had no other recourse. The third aspect, internal interactions. South Africa is very rich in this. The internal interactions that Omar is referring to is within the movement itself. And we had the imprisoned leadership with Mandela and others. We had an exiled leadership because we couldn't really operate openly in the country at all, and the repression was very intense. So we created our bases in independent African states to the north. And then there was an internal underground and a popular movement which was built up because of the fighting quality of the people and commitment, the samud of the South African people. The interaction started with Madiba, with Mandela in prison, who began to see that there were the possibilities of getting into talks with the regime because our forces were being built up, the mass struggle was on the rise, and the regime was in a quandary. But we didn't have the strength to overcome the regime militarily. We were never the equal. And he began the process of dialogue, and through communication with all three of those proponents, the prisoners, the exile, and the underground and the popular movement in the country, we managed to come to accord only, I would say, not because of charisma, it was important, but because we had a unified political vision and a discipline that had been created over the years leading up to the armed struggle. It's very important, that aspect. Then the incentive factor, I'll quickly end with the last 2 points, if I may. The incentive aspect was very important. The incentive wasn't just a question of holding out inducements to the armed struggle and the people fighting apartheid. It worked both ways. The business class in South Africa, the political elite and the economic elite could see that the struggle, popular struggle and armed struggle was creating havoc, and South Africa through the BDS movement internationally was becoming more and more isolated. So they wanted to sue for some kind of compromise. From the side of the liberation movement, we had incentives because the regime were promising or proposing that they would release political prisoners, they would unban the movements, and that they were prepared on negotiation. And this created the basis for a negotiated settlement, which we all know was extremely popular because we had a meeting of minds and of interests, mutual interests at that particular point in time, to bring about a sustained change and a change in which the popular forces of the people were absolutely principled and stood fast.
Okay, Ronnie.
That they would not compromise.
We're going to stop here, Ronnie. Sorry, because we don't have a lot of time. Thank you indeed for important points that you made. And now we will take audience question. راح نرجع هلا للقاعة لناخذ أسئلتكم. بعرف نحن يعني الوقت داهمنا، بتمنى تكون الأسئلة تكون يعني
give the floor to the ladies and gentlemen present with us here today to pose their questions. We know that time is running very fast, so we'd like to give the floor to Dr. Azzam. Dr. Azzam from Al Haramoon Center. Thank you very much for the rich book from a theoretical and practical perspectives. And here I would like to talk about what Hamza said when he talked about the linear movement from radicalism to peaceful work. Sometimes this transition can be reversed, so it can lead to demoderation or de-radicalization. So in my opinion, what is important is to understand the mechanisms whereby such transition happened. So the different levels that have been underlined by the book are very important, talking about the meso and the macro levels. And what I have here is a proposal more than a question. So I think it is very important to concentrate on the micro level in order to study the personality of the leaders, the psychological level, and the structure of decision making. So the studies that look into the armed groups and factions, they perhaps sometimes neglect such components. So to look at the intersubjective experience whereby they take decisions, whereby their ideologies are set, and the level of maneuver is practiced. شكرا جزيلا دكتور عزام. First of all, please forgive me because I haven't read the book yet, but in light of the interventions and observations that have been expressed, to some extent, I have some questions, particularly in light of the intervention that was presented by Dr. Ashur. So my question is to Dr. Ashur. So why wasn't the Palestinian example reflected in the book? So this is one of the examples that shows very clearly the transition from arms to other levels. We know that this is a national liberation battle in the face of an occupying force. So when I talk about the Palestinian cause, I talk in particular about Fatah and the transformations that we have seen in the last 60 years. The second point that I would like to talk about, and in light of the factors that have been underlined by Dr. Ashur, here I would like to ask Dr. Haidar. Dr. Haidar. The Sadr current and also Al-Mahdi army is part of the Shia movement. So what has made these two groups be impacted by the different factors and let go relatively of armed work compared to other groups that are partners to the institutions in power? Some of them are not partners. They control power in Iraq. The second point that I would like to underline, so very briefly, please, my question to Dr. Hamza. Dr. Hamza talked about incomplete transformations. Does this mean that are they in the process of becoming complete very soon? So what about the factors that have been mentioned by Dr. Ashur? Which one of them is much more impactful and would lead to the transformation that you talked about? Are we talking about a medium-term or a long-term process here? Thank you very much for this very important seminar. I have 3 questions. I would like to mention them very quickly. I would like to start with Dr. Omar. There are a number of specific details when it comes to new forms of civil war. So my question, to what extent, when it comes to these new classifications and after the Cold War, to what extent can we say when the armed factions defeat the representative of power, a democratic transition happens? So the examples did not concentrate only on the Middle East, but they also concentrated on Colombia, for instance. The second question is to Dr. Haider. Your intervention was very interesting. So the role, the regional role when it comes to the impact on the dynamic identity inside Iraq. So what is the impact when it becomes a political organization? And when does the regional level stop having an impact on the identity? My third question, thank you very much, Dr. Hamza. I have a question since I am Syrian and I am not specialized in armed factions, but I have read many studies about the role of intermediate fighters, their role not in peaceful transition, but in the signing of the peace deal in Colombia. So when we look at the situation where those factions control those, in the areas that are controlled by those factions, and I think that the regime has lost its symbolic clout. So the intermediate fighters or intermediary fighters, to what extent they have a role they play in such a situation? Safe. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. I would like to thank Dr. Omar, and I would like to thank the speakers as well. I was honored that I have read the book and the many chapters of the book. It was a book that added a lot to my knowledge about this topic. So my question is threefold. So the first question is to do with the regional and international factors as to how much they motivate these armed groups to move from armed activities to peaceful activities. To what extent there is a difference between having pressure on these groups and on the political regimes? So the answer is going to differ depending on the current regional and international circumstances and context. My second and third questions are to do with the testimony that was presented by Dr. Rushdi with regard to the Islamic Jama'ah in Egypt. I meticulously read this chapter, and there isn't much literature that tackles the experience of Islamic Jama'ah in Egypt. So it used to be a group that had a different view about the way the country should be ruled, and so much of the literature that reflected the way this Jama'ah was looking at the way the state should be ruled. And I would like to formulate my question. So the reason why violence was resorted to is to establish an Islamic State. Was this reason not realistic, and had the objective been changed into a different objective, would the situation have been different? Had the objective been changed, perhaps we would have seen much more impact, that violence would have much more impact. So the last question, so in a few seconds, so the Islamic Jama'ah and most leaders of the Islamic Jama'ah that are still in Egypt, they have been imprisoned with Muslim Brotherhood. So they shared with Muslim Brotherhood the same peaceful ideas. So I'm really sorry for having taken too long. Thank you very much, Dr. Ahmed. First of all, I would like to congratulate Dr. Omar Ashur, and I would like to congratulate his colleagues for publishing this very important book. So this adds a lot to the very limited literature that we have in this field, particularly in Arabic language. So this gives us a kind of a theoretical framework that tries to describe the different conflicts that exist in the region and also tries to explain the transformation undertaken by different armed groups that have moved from using weapons, from violence to peace, or going back to violence. We have the different groups that we have seen in Syria and Iraq, despite the fact that PKK tried to enter the political sphere. And we know that after that, Salah ad-Din Demirtas was detained, and the group continued using weapons till date. The same in Iraq. We have a number of armed groups that resorted to democratic political work, and these are considered a model when it comes to political stable work. For instance, the Peshmerga in Kurdistan, despite the fact that they dropped their weapons, they resorted back to them as a result of internal crises, and they had a number of issues with PUK and other movements in Iraqi Kurdistan. There is another example that was mentioned by Dr. Haidar. So we have Al Mahdi army who has seen a number of transformations. So they used weapons, they froze their military activities. So this is not an army that is led by Muqtada Sadr. This is the army of the absent Imam, as it is reflected in the Shia literature. So Dr. Haidar mentioned in his chapter as how there were a number of foreign interventions after the Fursan revolution, and Asa'ib Ahl al-Haqq became clear that it was supported by external groups, and Jaish al-Mahdi came back, and this was under the popular mobilization al-Hashd al-Shabi. So they came back in order to support the use of weapons under the umbrella of popular mobilization. And I do see new theoretical explanations. For instance, we have popular support similar to what has happened in Turkey, despite the fact that the political wing of PKK wanted to enter into political work, but they have not enjoyed any popular support at the level of Turkey. So I would like to congratulate you and thank you very much. Dr. Imad, thank you very much. Congratulations for the book once again. I would like to pose a question here. Talking about the regional factor, this was the first question that was posed. I would like, in particular, to talk about popular solidarity that had led to such change. In this multifaceted research book, how did you see the level of solidarity? You have shown that in South Africa and other areas. How do you see the importance of such factor? We'd like to take one last question. So because time is running very fast and we wouldn't have enough time to answer all these questions. Last question, very briefly, please. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Osama, Dr. Hamza, Dr. Haider, Dr. Omar. Thank you all. My question to Dr. Omar about the recent agreement by Tigray movement. How do you see this agreement movement from using weapons to peace? How do you see this transformation? So the huge transformations that we see around us, are these agreements are going to continue? Are they going to be sustainable? And the problem is going to come to an end? I said the last question, but this is going to be the last question. Dr. Ahmed, thank you very much. I would like to congratulate you for the book. Very quickly, this is an empirical and theoretical enigma. So there was a case that was mentioned in the book, which is the Algerian case, which is a very important example of moving from weapons to peace, from bullets to peace. So you talked about the theoretical outcomes, and also I would like to underline your experience in the Algerian experience. So moving from weapons to peace as a result of the pressure of war, as a result of civil war. So there was a kind of stagnation, a kind of a draw between both parties. And despite that, the military was unable to have things militarily decided in its favor and was undergoing many, many challenges, internal and external alike. And the continuation of fighting would have cost them much more than the other armed groups. And despite that, the armed groups had not benefited from the situation on the ground. And at the end, they gave in to the conditions of the reconciliation, and they had been banned and were not allowed to practice political work. So they benefited from a number of social and economic benefits. So it was not a move from armed group to political work. So this was a move to lack of activity, neither social nor political. And I do see that in some way that the title of the book is supportive and against the Algerian experience. So there was no a transformation to peaceful political work. So there was no political activity. So the Islamic Salvation Front is banned. And don't you think that this is a theoretical kind of enigma that cannot be solved? As it was underlined in your study, if we see that the cost that was paid as a result of this war, we have 250,000 of persons that disappeared or are lost, and this constitutes a case that is not understood.
Very quick answers, please. We start with Mr. Rushdie. We give 2 minutes each, please. Thank you for all. When the confrontation started with the Egyptian regime to establish Sharia rule in the 1990s, when the struggle began, the Mubarak regime went through different stages from 1981 to 1984. Used to say that violence can only lead to violence. There was some sort of calm. And after the assassination of Sadat and the implementation of the rulings, and then Jacques Chirac was as advised to the Mubarak regime that you have a phenomenon of terrorism. Then a new minister of the interior was appointed, and he started talking about hitting at the heart of the opponents. And so some members of the Jama'ah Islamiyya are from the Upper Egypt, and they have this question of avenging your dead is important. Of course, people were looking forward to one day and longing for the implementation of Sharia, but it was not stated as an objective. But although this does not change the objective, the current situation with the members of the group sharing prisons with the Brotherhood members because they were not targeted and then first now they're put in prison, this proves that the initiative was genuine and it was not based on the consequences of the situation, but it was aimed at achieving the interests of the people, and we were on the side of the people, and this confirms that the initiative was on the right path. Dr. Hamza? Yes, I agree with Azam that part of what I did not just criticize, I gave credit for Western studies because they moved us from studying Islamism to Islamists. But there were also the shortcomings were there too, and I tried to link between the macro, micro, and meso in the framing process. So I wanted to go beyond that, but I'm against the idea of taking one dimension and then discussing the interaction between them. For example, what Rahaf said, the example of Abu Yazan al-Shami in the Ahrar al-Sham case, how he was in prison inside Naya, how he studied in the Gulf, and he said that he was a jihadist Salafist, for example. But when the Ahrar al-Sham allowed the other groups to integrate with it, so for this reason I'm focused on the idea of interaction within this framework. The transformations are incomplete. Yes, this is true. Despite the main characters are there, what I try to say one way or another is there was a general impression that the changes take place after military defeat, and I wanted to argue that in the Syrian case, transformations started before the military defeat. They took place with the presence of an opportunity, not after the ending of the fighting. So this is what distinguishes them. In the case of Syria, as long as the government's control receded over large swathes of land, no longer was the reaction with the center. So the Syrian the changes took place because of ISIS and not the state. And for example, the slogans by the Hezbollah impacted the Sunni. The Daesh project is a project for the community. There is nothing but an Islamic state, no democracy, no other forms of ruling. The opportunity plays an important role at the macro level. For example, I chose three cases. The Ahrar al-Sham, they're an example of Salafi jihadi nationalism. The other group is a scientific Salafi group. The opportunity of the revolution allowed the opportunity for this group to engage in politics. The Faylaq al-Sham was close to the Muslim Brotherhood school of thought. Part of the study, Dr. Omar, I remember when I read his book in 2009 is a reference book. He said that as researchers in 2009, said researchers will come who will focus on the international aspect. Now, it's not a question of proxy war that the regional player is contributing to radicalism. They also contributing to the de-radicalization and the moderation aspects too. There is a question of desertification, for example, when a state supports, and then they, like Turkey used to support Ahrar al-Sham, and Ahrar al-Sham were no longer the preferred example of Turkey. Ahrar al-Sham ceased to exist despite the transformation. So therefore, the regional factor is important. And the most important thing I wanted to focus on what Mr. Osama has said. Saif also said something which is excellent. We must study transformation into peace outside studying violence itself. We must distinguish between the different types of violence. When there is a democratic process, then resorting to violence becomes wrong. But I think we need to dig more into separating between the different types of violence. Political violence is in Western studies is understood, but sectarian or jihadist or social violence, we cannot say that. For us, it suffices to say that managing violence can be one form of de-radicalization, in my opinion. Secondly, and Dr. Haider talked about something important. This is another shortcoming in the Harvard movement. You have Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Sadr. They work both in the violent range and the political. This is multifaceted. How do you want to study that? So therefore, what you want to reach is the concept of all transformations is violence. This is a Western approach. For us, violence does not constitute a theme, in my opinion at least. Thank you. Dr. Haider. Thank you very much. Maybe I will focus on the conception on violence as a concept. In my estimation, this really determined the situation of these armed factions. What Mr. Majid's question about High Al-Mahdi army is different than other groups. No, they are different. They are the first group which was started inside Iraq. I made a comparison between the Badr brigades and as an armed group of the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution. The Sadrist, the the Sadrist approach based on what Muhammad Baqir Sadr's influence left in the Iraqi society. Now, definitely, it's the biggest political grouping. Nobody can compete with them, whether inside the Shiite camp or outside it. They are different. Even Mr. Muqtada used to reject the comparison with the Badr organization because he says, if he used to say that if the Badr organization is made up of 10,000 or 20,000, then we are the whole of Iraq. The Americans also reached the conclusion that they constitute the biggest threat to Iraq, even bigger than Al Qaeda and its affiliates. And I saw writings of like major American commanders because their situation is different. And it's also from its mantle, many other groups were on. Dr. Rahaf and Dr. Muhammad, I can't remember. They talked about the internal and the external factors. The external factor starts with the ideal or the model. In my opinion, the Mahdi army's path was impacted by an Iranian model, and which is similar to the Hezbollah model. Eddie Berman called it the Hamas model, which is based on a political party, militia, and social movements. And this includes Hezbollah in Lebanon, Al-Mahdi army in Iraq, Hamas also. But I don't think necessarily the Al-Mahdi army followed this path. The debate even on the relationship with Iran is premature, and I mentioned this. The relationship with Iran, we do not just say randomly the weapons in their possession in the 2000 form were from Iran, Iranian weapons. This is supported by evidence. In 2004, the Iranians felt that Muqtada al-Sadr, if they wanted to design or remake a model of Hezbollah, like a religious leader who can build a militia and a political organization, they realized that Muqtada al-Sadr will not continue with them. For this reason, they started working on finding other groups like Asa'ib al-Khad. They call themselves the special groupings, and the American sources used to think that this was American names. But through my study of Al-Asa'ib Ahl al-Haq, they said this is a term they used. And this was not in the book, but in the 2008, and this is based on the testimony of a major commander. 2008, this organization fought the battle, and not Al-Mahdi army and the Jaish al-Mahdi army, Mahdi al-army. That's why Muqtada al-Sadr did not call the dead people who fell martyrs. As for the continuation of this all based on financing, and these organizations, whenever they are financially independent from outside help, they'll continue. But going back to the conception, I think the mere definition that this is a civil regional war, when people define ISIS as a Sunni faction and their rise should be met with a Shiite counter group. And this is the first political decision in Iraq started from 2012 when a feeling was born that Iraq in its current situation cannot face up to challenges and they need to ask the help from outside the country. So al-Maliki, when the same people he fought in 2008 and 2014, he started asking their help. I think the Peshmerga case warrants a lot of attention because of the situation regarding the Hashd al-Sha'bi popular mobilization, and also I think we will leave it there. We conclude with Dr. Omar. Now we went beyond the 2 hours, so therefore I'll be very brief about de-radicalization and the de-radicalization failure, as it's called sometimes. The book separated between the initiation and continuation. The continuation has its conditions, which is explained in detail in the book, and all of this is related to continuation, but the cases which started then collapsed are many, but the Muslim Brotherhood went through this many times when in 1951, which went through even the assassination of the leader of the armed wing, and I'm talking about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. And then there was 69 and 73, which the Colombian case is very clear and is relative now. Continuity does not know a certain date. Sometimes continuity is more difficult than initiation. For example, I started the book when the leader of the Islamic group leading the attack on Bab al-Aziziyya. So continuation was different than initiation. As for the external factor, Dr. Hamza and Dr. Haider covered this. An important point about the external factor, this can help either to make or break the process. And for example, the Cuban example is important. Fidel Castro, yes, we tried in all Latin American countries except Mexico, we tried to overthrow the regimes there, but also who guaranteed the peace negotiations between the FARC and the Colombian government was Cuba too. Maybe this is similar to the Iranian case in Iraq and other countries in the region. As for what Dr. Majid said, we try to select the book's themes on armed groups and we avoided resisting occupation because this is a sacred right, and we also avoided the hybrid cases we try to avoid. So either you gave up and renounced armed struggle, or you are still engaged in it, but you don't have a political party, or you don't have the opportunity to, do not have the opportunity, like some in case of some movements in Syria. For this reason, we chose this. As for the mid-ranks, very important, Dr. Rahaf, in all cases almost, maybe what Dr. Glab said, he is not with us. If he were, he could have responded to what Ronnie said, but he talked in detail about the role of the middle ranks to convince both the upper strata of the leadership and the grassroots, and the same applies to the Jama'ah Islamiyah in Egypt. Maybe there was a dialogue with the middle ranks. They said we get our orders, we're not convinced, but we refuse to implement them or implement these commands, orders. As for victory, which leads to democratization, when a revolutionary armed group achieves victory, does this lead to democratization? No. Uh, there's a book about 320 over cases. The vast majority of groups which win by fighting and war do not give in to democracy. Sandinistas did that. They won by war, but they gave up the armed struggle for the sake of peace. And also, the Ethiopian case is also mentioned in the book in detail. This was a coalition of armed groups more than democratization. The democratization came with Abiy Ahmed, or part of it, but before that it was a coalition of factions to avoid more of civil war situation. I'll leave it here because thank you very much. We can talk about this. Another caveat, this question about was a challenge in the book because Erdogan is popular and Öcalan has they are very charismatic both, but they failed for other reasons. They failed, the process failed not because of the fighting, but the variables conflicted. Thank you very much, Omar, Haidar, Hamza, Rushdie, and Ronnie, for all these interventions and for this magnificent effort. The book is available through our center and Amazon and Google Play for those who are interested. Even the cover is very distinguished. This is your design. Thank you very much for your attendance, and we look forward to seeing you on more occasions.